the reason I've got to this is we've got a display in the back office of the Hawley collection of sheep shears. So that's what attracted me. Saw that, went to Jeff Tweedale's tool book, which is less known than his cutlery book, and there's quite a lot of information about Ward Payne. So I thought, right, we're off. There's a talk here, and it doesn't disappoint. So we're talking about Ward Payne. Ranger logos there, but we'll. 1803, established by David Ward. Initially Ward and Pearson partnership, but was dissolved in 1806 to become David Ward and Co. So 1816, they're listed in the directory as an edged tool manufacturer. And it's funny, sometimes when you say, what is the Hawley collection? The Hawley collection really is edge tools, light edge tools. We don't do the heavy engineering. We're not doing the heavy steel making, but, and you'd include cutlery and sort of silversmithing things as light edge tools. And they're on Trippett Lane. And again, it's these areas that we now think about as being somewhere you might go to the Dog and Partridge or the Scout Shop or Flats, but it was industrial. 1822, David died, and his wife carried on the business. And that's quite common, actually. We get that. And as David Warden's son, and his son was Henry. It gets a bit tragic here because Henry died when he was aged 28. So his brother Edward managed the Ward Works. At this point, we're at West Street, so they've not gone far from Trippett Lane, the corner of West Street and Portobello Road. And there we've got the logo of the company, which is a couple of sort of almost like file cutting hammers sitting on top of an anvil. Edward died when he was 29. Something about this family, I don't know whether the family wasn't that robust in its health. And his only son David was too young to run the company. So the son-in-law, Henry Payne, was brought into the partnership, hence the Ward and the Payne. 1844, they had a dispute over another trademark. Ward Payne successfully sued Swinscoe and Manuel. So, we've said this thing about if you're a tool company or you're a cutlery company, it's a bit of a job coming up with a logo and the name for your works because, so many other people have used them. So, but clearly they were upset about somebody, and on top left there you've got this thing, disgraceful system of piracy. 1850, Henry died aged 37 at Mount View on Glossop Road. So again, I suppose that notion, the works were down West Street, so it's not that far to travel to go back up to your home. His wife Anne retained the controlling interest in the company till 1856, when David Ward, remember he was the one who wasn't old enough, was 21 and was able to become a director. He had one other brother who'd been involved in the firm, but unfortunately ended up as an inmate in York lunatic assignment. So it wasn't, it wasn't a great sort of start in life for this family, was it? So 1856, the original partnership of Edward and Henry was dissolved. A new one between David Ward and Anne Payne created the trading name Ward and Payne, but with ownership reverted wholly to the Ward family. David was to lead the company for the next 30 years. So this is very much the story of one man who actually took a company to a very prominent position. So they had a growing reputation. So in 1851, along with many other Sheffield companies, they won a medal at the Great Exhibition. And it's interesting, at the front of the catalogue, that's the really big catalogue that's at the back, we've got this list of places. So it's saying they were established in 1803, but all those medals, and when you read down the list of those medals, Philadelphia, at that time, Philadelphia was the capital of the USA before Washington. Okay, so to get a medal from Philadelphia was really good. So, what we're really saying is, 1850, 1860, 1870, this was an international company. And they were sending stuff all over the world. They had 118 workers, so, reasonable sized firm, not massive, but a reasonable sized firm. Ward was ambitious. In 1863, he began sheep shear production in a small way. He'd spotted a gap in the market, which was caused by the American Civil War. So that was a shift from cotton to wool. Okay? And in a sense, the places where there were a lot of sheep, South Africa, Australia, South America. So quite interesting, a man who had that acumen of business to think, where's the future market going to be? Where are people going to want to buy my stuff? The page to the right is actually one that comes out the catalogue, which is a bit later. But again, it starts to give you this notion, illustrated catalogue, edge tools, spades, shovels, sheep shears, garden tools, files, uncut cobbling, and all actually in terms of this company. They made an awful lot of stuff. Further expansion. 1864, he decided to get into the market for woodworking tools. So he'd spotted the market for sheep shears, and now he thought there's a market for woodworking tools. And he hired some, and it was, woodworking was dominated by London firms, not Sheffield companies. So he hired the best London carving toolmaker, James Addis. And in 1871, he acquired the mark of James's brother, S. Addis, and was complimented for bringing the work into the town. So quite a nice example of, we talk about offshoring and work leaving the city. This was an example of a significant portion of work coming into Sheffield, and he was commended for doing that. The things that were holding him back, it was hampered by the productive capacity and limited manufacturing techniques. On the right, we've got one of those famous, etching, making the factory look better than it was, with the classic carriages going past. I still don't know to this day, did the same person do all of them? Because every catalogue, they seem to have one of them. And we all know that really the outside looked pretty good, but out the back it was lots and lots of little workshops. Now in 1871, his workforce was 196 men, doesn't mention any women, 14 girls and 10 boys. And there's always a challenge when you see that, because I can think, I can remember the school leaving age, went up to 16, were they only 15? But, how old were these children that were put into the factory? And there is a suggestion that working conditions were dismal, and sheep shears, it was a complicated process assembling them. I'm not going to talk quite much about the manufacturing process for sheep shears, but if you go on the Ken Hawley YouTube site, there's a picture of them making them at Bergen and Ball. And I sort of think, they're really simple product, sheep shears, but actually it's much more complicated in terms of the different stages, and dangerous. You can see that all the sheep shears on there have got a band to stop them opening, because stop you getting cut with them. Shortly after starting to make sheep shears, government inspectors visited. Quite interesting, isn't it? Someone who's a teacher who very rarely got visited by Ofsted. Just that notion that there were government inspectors in the sort of 1860s, 1870s. They visited, they had boys and girls as young as 12, bending, hammering, oiling, and packaging shears, which were all dangerous occupations. Working hours were 8:30 till 7, with overtime when the factory was busy. There's not much scope to fit in overtime here, and it doesn't actually say whether they got the weekends off. David emphasised the need for this to compete with overseas competition. So he says to the inspectors, I need to employ kids to compete with the Germans, for instance. But the inspectors had a little quote in there, George Allensworth, a 9-year-old cellar lad in the crucible furnace, told the inspectors, on a Saturday morning we had to begin at 3. So I stopped here all night, lived 5 miles off, slept on the furnace floor overnight with an apron under me and a bit of a jacket over me. The 2 other days I have to be here at 9 a.m. And he said, it's hot here, isn't it? In the furnace room. So, again, but, it's great that we've got that information. So this is the thing that inspired the talk in the first place, a display of sheep shears. You see the red label on it, which means it's something we've catalogued. The other thing we probably haven't done is, and this is back to the difference between the Hawley collection possibly having 100,000 items, but we've only catalogued 48,000. The other things haven't got red labels on, which might mean they haven't been individually catalogued. Right, so he's already got this problem. He's basically saying, look, I'm struggling to pay enough wages and I need to employ kids who presumably I'm not paying a lot of money to do it. In 1868, he introduced an edge tool forging machine to keep the costs down, but the workers feared job losses, wage cuts, and a weakening of bargaining power. So what did David do? He fired the workers, okay? They hit back with intimidation and occasional violence. In 1860, the workers succeeded in getting the hated J.B. Addis, who you remember were the people who brought the work up from London, sacked, and they also got back pay for this strike. And I think on the right hand side it's saying they got something like 30 shillings for their back pay. One of the reasons they wouldn't let Addis join the union, because he was from London. We're Sheffield. We don't want any incomers coming and joining our union. But there was a government trade union into trade union outrages in other parts of the country, but also Sheffield. And Ward's position grew stronger, and he introduced a forging machine for all steel shears. Under the old system, men produced 15 dozen shears a week. With the new machinery, they could produce 1 a minute. Leap in productivity. Ward reached an accommodation with the Forgers' Union, but the Grinders' Union rejected cuts in wages and changes to working practices. Ward sacked them all and brought in non-union labour. He wasn't sort of fond of the unions. His opinion of the edge tool grinders. They indulge in late hours in the morning and retire early in the evening. Thus it frequently happens they do not do average 7 hours a day. They oft avail themselves of an apprenticeship without the knowledge of their employer. The grinder, his master, draws a clear 15 shillings to 20 shillings as a result of the lad's work, and thus indulges his propensity for attending sports such as Bramall Lane, Newhall and Queen's Ground. It seems to me that the business cannot long survive such practices with such short labour hours. So it is interesting, you know, this chap David Ward, he was spotting new markets and he was trying to constantly modernise, but obviously, you know, we were moving from that handmade system to things made by machines and equipment, and there was a constant tension then, you know, say this is in 1886. These pictures appear in the 1911 catalogue. Spot the amusing thing in this picture. Yeah, well, that's right. You know, it could almost be a cardboard cutout, the chap on the right. I mean, I think basically, do you think he was looking miserable in the picture and they've touched it up to make him look happy? I don't know, but in a sense, it's blatantly been doctored. And they say this appeared in the 1911 catalogue, so obviously the photograph is older than that. Surely it must have been the case when they were posing for photographs, which wasn't that common a thing, they would have made some effort to make the place look better and, well, I say, went to certain extremes to make the workers look happier. Well, there's a few of these, so they're all in the front of the catalogue. So, forging garden shears, you know, of course, you'll notice the total absence of any health and safety equipment, which was absolutely typical of the age. Sheep shear, you know, I mean, look at the pile of sheep shears that's there to be whatever they're going to do with them, bend them. This is quite interesting. So again, I think the nearest chap's had his face doctored. Whether he had a beard or not, I don't know. But it's interesting seeing the number of grinding holes, actually. When you go to Shepherd's Wheel and you see a couple of grinding holes, you know, there you've got quite a lot. On the one hand, it almost looks like there's a mirror halfway across, isn't it? But I think, you know, a lot of grinding holes there. And you can see on the right-hand side there's somebody there that looks like they've got a hat on. And all the workers, of course, wearing caps. So bending sheep shears, that looks a busy room. You know, again, chap with a bowler hat. Does he have extra status? Is he the boss? Is he the foreman? Or he just likes wearing a bowler hat to work? And this is quite nice, isn't it? You know, and it's funny, when there was that list of the workers, there was no mention of women working for the factory. But actually, clearly, in this, often at that end stage, the packing, possibly the polishing, it was often women that did that job. And you can see there's a lot of stock in that room. And actually, this is fairly typical of this company. They made a massive range of products, and they carried a lot of stock. So business was booming. So obviously he was, you know, trying to get the most out of his workforce, but he looked to new markets, Russia, Germany, and Scandinavia. Don't often hear actually mention of Sheffield cutlery companies, for instance, doing business with Russia, but tools might have been a totally different thing. Sent an agent to the Cape, and the company found favour with South American wool shearers. The most prized market was Australia and New Zealand, the former having 90 million sheep. So, you know, there's no shortage of work. 1880, Ward visited Australia and then San Francisco. So in 1880, just setting out on a journey like that. And presumably either carrying goods to show people or a catalogue to show people. I think probably some goods, you know, so I don't know how many trunks he took with him. And the firm won gold medals at exhibitions, Cape Town 1877, Melbourne 1880. So, you know, as well as spotting gaps in the market, as well as innovating in terms of machinery, they were obviously making things of quality that were better than some of the other things that were on offer. By the end of the 1870s, there was said to be the leading house in shears. And there would have been other sorts, you know, there might have been shears for cutting metal, and for other purposes. They had 160 workers making shears out of a total workforce of 450. 1877, they took over the Limbrick wheel on the River Loxley at Alderton, which had been empty since the Sheffield flood. So again, a bit of expansion. He redeveloped the site, building a 2-storey works with a dam and a water wheel for grinding. And then further round into Hillsborough, he had the Limbrick Works, providing the facility for spade and shovel manufacture. And that's the first we've heard about spade and shovels. 1887, with John Sorby and Sons, he opposed an extension of Bergen and Ball's shears patent. So I mentioned that video of making sheep shears on our YouTube channel. That's actually Bergen and Ball's factory making that. So interesting, again, this tension between people in Sheffield who made the same product, but fiercely guarding their own and possibly restricting the activity where possible with others. Well, he was an upstanding citizen of Sheffield. He was on the town, from 1886, he was on the town council. I'm not quite sure. He became a councillor there, and I don't suspect he had a little local election, and people went around and had the vote, and actually, who carried votes in 1886. In 1877, he was the master cutler. So master cutler every year has a cutler's feast, which they pay for, invite the great and the good too, but actually he also put on a slap-up meal for his workers. I don't know whether he did it in the cutler's hall or not. He also hosted a banquet for General Grant, Ulysses Grant, who'd been the 18th President of the United States. Again, so interesting sort of circles he was moving in. 1877, just after he'd been master cutler, he became mayor because somebody dropped out at the last minute, and he was sort of one of the great and the good who was sort of waiting in the wings and said, please, will you do that? And actually, we've had quite a negative view of him so far treating the workers, but one of the first things he did, he got together and was raising funds for poor relief. And certainly that time in Sheffield, there was a lot of people living in poverty. He was a churchman and a conservative. And as well as Ward Payne, he held several directorships. It's interesting that question, how effective can you be in several companies at the same time? But he was clearly somebody that was in demand. He enjoyed country pursuits, particularly grouse shooting. Okay, and again, quite a lot of the people around the cutler's companies, they were definitely into shooting. And it was either target practice or it was shooting on the moors. 18th of November 1889, after visiting, so he'd been to the works, he'd been to a charity, he rushed to the Victoria station, not the Midland station, with his wife to get the train to Lincoln, and unfortunately, he had a fatal heart attack. So despite his tensions with his workers, 200 of them attended his funeral. And he was interred in his family vault in Ecclesall churchyard. He left 58,000, which his cash is 6.3 million. So he did well out of it. So just have a look at some of the things that were made. So wood carving tools. Ward Payne brought new life to these products, having 450 different paddles and enormous stock. Basically, they are for fine, almost like wood engraving. And on the right, the sort of three elements that go into this talk. One is what Geoffrey Tweedale's written. One is the objects, but then we've also got family histories and ephemera. Okay, and I found this picture of a nun, which Ken's collected at some point. I've no idea who the nun is, but you can imagine some convent where the reality is wood carving. And on the left, actually, some of these are ladies' wood carving sets. And again, if you'd said, is that a common habit of ladies in Victorian times? Well, perhaps it was. More wood carving sets. And it's interesting, on the right-hand side, the sort of products of that wood carving. Now, I don't know if any of you are here, I don't know, it's quite a few years ago now, we did a talk about bread knives and breadboards. Okay? And there's a lady in London, and they've got this massive museum, and I sort of talked about the bread knives, and then she came on and talked about the breadboards as we were waiting for the flood to come outside. But again, it sort of fits together a little bit now, and the notion that we had all these wonderful tools that are in Sheffield, and also we had that sense of carving, and there's three bread knives on there with carved handles. And again, the work, because I think the guy in Sheffield's work called George Wing, who was a real expert carver, but again, there was a company that did that, Bramall's, who actually made them. So it was quite a significant industry, and to buy a carved breadboard goes for a decent price. Well, again, just showing this specialism, and again, it's a few of these things on here. I'm not sure what they're for, but it was interesting. I've just drawn by that middle block in there, just showing all these patterns of sort of punches. So I guess you'd have punched that shape, and then you'd have got it out with one of these gouges. And I guess in a sense, it made it a little bit easier. But I guess it was a skillful job, and you can imagine, you get 3/4 of the way through your carving, and then all of a sudden you take the wrong bit out and you have to start again. Or you have to alter your design. But again, so they're obviously selling at least 60 different punches for getting different shapes out there. These are interesting. I mean, it might sound sad, but I've got one of these hanging over my fireplace. I once bought it somewhere. It was just such a lovely item. But what is strange about this company, so there's one up there, it says Liverpool jigger knife. Now, was it they just cut things in a particular way in Liverpool, therefore they wanted a Liverpool knife? Was it that was just some means of describing that particular product? Like we're in Sheffield and we like Henderson's relish because it comes from Sheffield. So I don't know whether that was a really smart move just to get to the Liverpool market, or whether that was just the way they talked about things. And this runs, so on the axes on the right, the top one is Was it you lived in Kent, I want a Kent axe, or was it was just a way to describe their products? And I don't know, probably you could have gone through the catalogue and collected 10 items that all had Kent in front of them. So I don't know, it was clever marketing. It was a way to hit those places or not. And again, some of them will get foreign items. I like this one on the left because it's got a couple of things on that I've had at previous talks. So the third thing down there, when I get that out and show that to people, they haven't got a clue what it is. And then I say it's a potato knife. And just like when I found out it was a potato knife, I had no idea how it was used. So I now know there's at least 2 companies in Sheffield that sold potato knives. The potato knife, that's for essentially making bubble and squeak in a pan. So you've got some depth to get in your big frying pan and move things around. Yeah, again, in fact, when I tell people, they don't believe it, but there it is, it's in the catalogue. And then you get one like this, which could be a cooked ham knife that is similar but not the same. And you've got some top here. You've got some very interesting potato knives. Up there, you've got an oyster knife. So all of a sudden, we've got this company that's gone from hand tools. I mean, this is for making breadcrumbs, sort of a breadcrumb rasp. So you've got a lot of interesting objects. In the Hawley collection, we've got quite a nice collection of tin openers, and again, some really interesting tin openers there. So it's just highlighting, they have the woodworkers stuff, but they're also doing things with a much bigger range. A grinder's wheel, and it's interesting, isn't it? How old are the 2 young lads doing that? And I'm not sure whether, again, it looks a bit posed, doesn't it, in the Sunday best doing a sort of industrial type bit of work. But, we had the choice of, more than a dozen different oil cans. Again, I say the staggering thing about this company is the range of things they make. Sheep shears. So I finally got sheep shears. Sheep shears for South America, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Russia, and the continent. And again, they've all got different names and they've all got different titles. The biggest difference is you almost sort of get the one where you've got 2 circular loops and you've got 1 big circular loop on the non-cutting end. You wouldn't have contacted Ward Payne saying, I want a pair of sheep shears. You'd have to say, what sort of sheep shears did you want? And some of them would have been favoured in particular places. So some might have been favoured in South America. Some of them might have been favoured in Australia and New Zealand. Ward Payne, Shepherd, sheep shears. And then you can see this sort of transition towards some form of clippers. And obviously now, if you saw people shearing sheep, most of them would be doing it with electric clippers. So that, I don't think this company ever got as far as making electric clippers. A bit like some of the companies in Sheffield that started to make electric razors. But there clearly was that transition. And you can probably imagine the workers thinking, these clippers will never catch on. I'm sticking with my sheep shears. And I think there'll still be purists around the world who are using sheep shears. Where the best place to source them now is, I'm not sure. So the business passed from David Ward to his 3 sons, David, Herbert, and Edwin. In 1899, there was a fire at the Limbrick Works, which disrupted production. It's interesting, another sort of, another picture of the works. Look at the grindstones and the big grindstones that are actually lined up underneath those windows on the right-hand side. I don't know, there's maybe 100, there's hundreds of them in that picture. And that's something I've never seen before in one of these diagrammatic pictures of these engravings of some of these factories. So in 1911, they published a massive catalogue, possibly the largest ever produced in Sheffield. So it was 501 pages. I'm often talking about cutlery catalogues, and I think, wow, they're 250 pages long. So this is 500 pages. It's twice as much. But foreign competition was increasing. So this is the catalogue. We have pleasure in presenting to our friends this very enlarged edition of our catalogue of all description of tools. And so it goes on with this lovely sort of slight ramble about, they're all of good quality and the catalogue's being added and we've got new numbers. And I like this number of catalogues we've got in the Hawley collection that have got bits cut out of them is quite staggering. And clearly, if you want to buy one, that is something that does do quite a lot of damage to the quality and quality and the price. But yeah. The other thing we don't know is how often did they produce these catalogues? And again, who were the catalogues for? I think if you wrote to Ward Payne and said, can I have a catalogue? They'd probably say, bugger off. 501 pages. A retailer would probably have them. A shop might actually have them. But this, this was the means of finding out what they actually made. Turn screws. I think one of the first things I sort of learned from Ken Hawley was a screwdriver is not a screwdriver, it's a turn screw. So in Sheffield parlance, that's what you call a screwdriver. You call it a turn screw. And there it is, because the catalogue is talking about handled turn screw. A London pattern turn screw. Interesting that there were quite a lot of the things in this catalogue have the word London in front of them. And if you remember, those Addis brothers came from London. So that notion about the London pattern, and of course, London would have been a much bigger market than Sheffield or some of the other places. So again, anything that said London on it was probably another bit of really smart marketing. A couple of other things about Ward Payne. They made their own steel. I'm talking to somebody at the moment he was almost a bit upset about the name on a knife blade because it's almost slightly implied that every name that was on the knives meant they made them. And it's this notion, I talked to Colin about this earlier, that whole notion about did some companies produce certain things and then give them to lots of other companies who then branded them? But I think this was an interesting example of a company that possibly did all the stages of some of the things themselves. So, there weren't that many companies in Sheffield, whether they're cutlery companies or whether they're tool companies, that were actually producing their own steel. But this company was doing that, and they've got all sorts of different strengths of steel. This is a chisel steel ingot. So generally this would have been crucible steel, I think. It's generally got shear steel written on it somewhere, but really quite interesting. And so again, they were offering people a range of different steels. The permutations on this whole range of products. On the back there's a page of gouge patterns, and there's probably 100 different gouges, 120 different gouges on there. We were looking at something earlier, I think it was hammers, and you could have 7 or 8 different weights for the hammers. And again, back to that question, could they possibly hold these things in stock? Doesn't seem sensible. And then the other thing, well, if you're going to make the steel, they could offer it in different sections to people. So presumably they would have had some business selling steel onto other manufacturers who would be making it into other things. So really, a company that did everything. Spade, call a spade a spade. If any of us went to buy a spade now, we'd be lucky if you had the choice of 2. And again, these have all got different titles. Solid Start London traded spade. And every one of these, they're all slightly different, but on the other hand, they all look pretty similar. There may be different lengths, they may have different steel on them, but this is just a fraction. There were pages and pages of spades. Now, an interesting question: did they make the handles? And we were talking earlier about what were the handles made of. I think ash was often favoured for the handles for tools. But and at one point we talked about when they went to the Limbrick Works, that was one of the things that they were doing, is they were making spades there, spades and shovels. But there's probably another 7 or 8 pages of spades in that catalogue. So the range, absolutely stacked. You've got your sides there. So top right there, you've got the Philadelphia sickle. So earlier, we had a reference to, well, we've got an award, hadn't we, from Philadelphia. This is the Poland sickle. This is the Spanish sickle. This is the Chilean Peru sickle. Could say it's the Paddington Bear sickle, but so it goes on. So the choice, that was the Brazil sickle. So the absolute massive range of different items. Then on the right-hand side, we've got bill hooks, which were very good for chopping firewood. And again, you've got the range there, and that first one, it says London on it. And you got the London one, or you got the Lincoln one. Can you imagine going into Ken Hawley's tool shop and saying, "I want a London bill hook. I don't want a Lincoln one." And there's a Liverpool bill hook. But as I say, I really don't know whether this was branding or really smart attacking the market. Loss of markets during the war. 1920, the workforce was down to 150. After the post-war boom, the company was left with large stocks. Now, that doesn't really surprise us, does it? Given the rest of what we've looked at there. 1923, Edwin died. David brought both his sons into the business, David, Leslie and Stanley. 1926, they became limited. Leslie had poor health. The West Street factory was sold and demolished, and the Limbrick Works was their only site. Still, this almost goes back to that stock issue. This could have been a cutlery catalogue, because they were selling everything. They were selling scissors, razors, pen and pocket knives, almost certainly bringing these in from somebody else, but to pad out the catalogue and just see everything that was offered. 1930, the family moved to Essex to become farmers. So presumably they took some of the wealth out of the company, bought some land. David died, he left his share to David, who died the following year. So still going in 1950, the firm was listed as Crucible Steel and Light Edge Tool Manufacturer. By the mid-50s, the family had pulled out the firm. They got shot. 1956, they had a new chairman, Archibald Hattersley, who tried to breathe new life into the firm. And so he made some rolling mills for the spades and forks and new heat treatment facilities. And he acquired another Sheffield company, F.G. Pearson. 1959, they won a design award for their Aristocrat socket chisel. I just found, again, going through the Hawley collection, just some interesting ephemera. That notion of, what would you like for Christmas? We could speculate, couldn't we, what was the suitable thing for his and hers? But clearly it was the sort of things from their product range, which you can see on your right. Darling, would you like a pair of, garden shears for Christmas? Or whatever. So it really looks dated, doesn't it, those adverts? But again, I bet at the time, they'd paid some people money to do these fabulous adverts for them. This, the most complete garden promotion ever, planned for garden tools and wooden chisels. 1960, they introduced stainless steel garden tools, which again might be something we take for granted now. 1961, they had about 200 workers. They had a forge with a 35-ton hammer to turn out 100,000 pairs of cut-easy garden shears. Interesting, that play on words, just to, you go into your garden centre and say, I want a cut-easy pair of garden shears. 1967, they were taken over by Wilkinson Sword. It didn't work. The merger failed. Wilkinson Sword lost £75,000. 1971, the factory was gutted by fire and production ceased. So 1982, Ward Payne was struck off the company register, and that was the end of what had been this massive company. So thanks to Jeff Tweedale for the information. Thanks to Ken for being able to raid the collection for lots of different stuff.